I am joined today by a wonderful panel who you will be introduced to in a moment. But for now, I'd like to just acknowledge my co-chairs, Pallavi Roy and Rob Chase. Together, we are the co-chairs of the Fragile State Working Group. Now, before we begin with the main topic of today's session, I'd like to give a brief background on the Scaling Community of Practice, especially if you're new to our community. The Scaling Community of Practice, or SCOP, is now in its 11th year, which seems pretty amazing. It's grown from about 50 participants in 2015 to over 5,000, which is also amazing. It's free to everyone to join, and you can do so here on our website, which I am dropping in the chat. The SCOP is a network of development and climate practitioners and experts who want to learn and contribute to the scaling agenda, which is basically helping to achieve sustainable impact that matches the scale of the need or matches the scale of the problem. The SCOP has 9 working groups, of which the Fragile States Working Group is one. And the community publishes reports on scaling experiences of its members, including a regular newsletter. It also produces its own knowledge products, which you can find on the SCOP website, which I've dropped in the chat. Finally, it organizes events like this annual forum to exchange scaling knowledge from our practitioners and promote action. This year's 2-week forum marks a significant milestone for the community. It's the official launch of the scaling campaign from now until 2030. What this campaign is a collective effort to strengthen the systems, standards, and partnerships needed to make transformational scaling the norm across development and climate ecosystems. In the working group sessions, we're reflecting on how scaling works in each working group sector and thematic areas and how you can all contribute to the goals of the scaling campaign. Please join as many of the sessions as you can. We're still going on tomorrow and into next week, and especially the last session on Friday, March 6th, when we will summarize the main takeaways from the annual forum meetings and issue a call of action to support the scaling campaign 2026 to 2030. Now, a few logistics and housekeeping for our meeting today. Please use the chat function, which you're seeing here active already, to pose any questions. And you can really pose these questions as we go along in the panel. I will be monitoring the chat and selecting questions for our panelists once they've had a chance to give their initial presentations. And also, you will note that this session is being recorded. That's really to help share this on our website with those who couldn't attend live today. We have global members, so a lot of people in certain parts of the world, this is very late for them and they're not here. So the recording will be made available on the website and also help us take good notes for our after event report. We will also be translating this event into Spanish and French so that colleagues around the world have more accessibility to our content. With that, I will turn it over to Pallavi to introduce our panelists.
Thanks so much, Chris, for that introduction. The first panelist that we have is Robert Chase. Now, Robert, as Chris mentioned, is also co-chair of our working group, but we've somehow persuaded him because of his wealth of experience to be a panelist here for this session. Now, Robert is a practice manager for social policy in the World Bank's West Africa region. In that role, Rob has responsibility for a portfolio that supports vulnerable people, households, and communities, promoting resilience with social safety nets, community-driven development, and the #JobsNow programs for women, youth, and displaced peoples. And he works across really adverse contexts and has scaling as one of his primary preoccupations, if not an occupation as such. He works in countries from Sierra Leone to the Republic of Congo. His team seeks to strengthen the humanitarian development nexus. That's the scale that we are really looking for, the pathway for prosperity and sustainability, collaborating with governments, humanitarian actors, and bilateral development agencies to provide urgent support in crises to build shock responsive social protection systems, which is really the need of the hour in many parts of the world today, not just in Africa. Prior to joining the World Bank, he was a member of the economics faculty of Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies, coordinating the development economics program. With this background and with efforts around the development community to scale up impacts, he also serves as co-chair for this panel and this working group. The next speaker will be Robert Jenkins, who comes with, again, a wealth of experience in severely conflict-affected and vulnerable situations. He is a strategic advisor and former senior executive at the U.S. Agency for International Development, sorely missed USAID, where he served for more than 26 years in leadership roles spanning crisis response, stabilization, foreign assistance reform. As assistant to the administrator, he led the creation of USAID's Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization. He oversaw a £300 million portfolio across 35 plus countries. That's no mean feat. He previously directed multi-billion-dollar humanitarian and conflict portfolios and managed large interagency initiatives in very complex high-risk environments. Rob was also the director of the Office of Transition Initiatives for 8 years and now advises senior leaders on organizational transformation, governance reform, and strategy in an era of significant geopolitical disruption. And I think we all know what that means. Our next speaker is going to be Ivy Cooperberg. She's country officer for Haiti at the International Finance Corporation. Ivy is the country officer at Haiti, as I said, working on sourcing key investments for Haiti in the renewable energy, agriculture, and healthcare space, as well as supporting key advisory work in horticulture and digital financial services. Her intervention will certainly prove to be extremely productive because I'm sure there are a lot of us out there who want to know how you can progress private sector investment and scaling opportunities in fragile and conflict-affected states like Haiti. You think it's not possible, it's a counterfactual, but there you go, Ivy might have some lessons for us and will have lessons for us. Before joining IFC, she worked on impact investments and upstream initiatives in West and Central Africa, as well as promoting partnerships in FDI for Latin America and the Caribbean. Ivy holds a postgraduate degree in the field of international relations from Harvard University and an undergraduate degree in history from Rice University. Fabulous combination. And our last speaker, and I'm really, really tempted to use a cliche last but not the least because this is really true, is Bumi Kamara. Bumi is a development economist with over 20 years of experience spanning academia, central banking, and international development practice. He currently serves as the chief fragility economist at the African Development Bank, following 5 years as a senior country economist within the institution. His previous professional engagements include roles as an economist at the World Bank, director of research and consultancy at the University of the Gambia and the Management Development Institute, as well as senior banking officer at the Central Bank of the Gambia. Bumi holds a PhD in economics from the University of Göttingen in Germany. He also earned master's degrees from Williams College in Massachusetts and the University of Malawi. So that's a really short introduction for a very illustrious panel, but here we go. Over to you, Rob. And I think somebody had something to say about Rob right here. Speaking from experience, Rob Jenkins is also an amazing boss, mentor, and human. I thought I should just put that out for you, Rob. So, I will invite another Rob first, and then you're on, Rob Jenkins. Robert Chase, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Pallavi. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the introduction. It's great to be co-chairing this working group with you both, but also particularly to be part of this panel with such distinguished participants. Look forward to being part of the conversation. Without, again, risking cliche, we are at a pivotal moment for scaling, for fragile states, and for development overall. And I want to use a quick analogy to frame the discussion of working on scaling in fragile states at this point. And Ivy, this is in your honor to some extent, because I want to consider the case of Haiti. So Haiti's always been one of the most difficult contexts to operate. There are longstanding challenges that we are all aware of, and I'm sure Ivy will speak to. And then if we consider January 12th, 2010, Haiti was hit by a 7.9-degree earthquake that completely destroyed whatever fragile infrastructure was available and posed just a spectacularly difficult moment for both the people of Haiti and for the development community. The reason I want to bring up this as an analogy is just like Haiti prior to earthquake, fragile states, this working group considers it's always a very difficult environment. It's always a real challenge to scale things up, and I'll speak a little bit to some of those challenges in my framing. And in that difficult context, the development community has been hit by an earthquake. I would say that the way in that already difficult context, we have had to deal with a once in a lifetime upheaval in the way development community is operating, some of the financing that has had to change, not just with USAID being dismantled, I'm not sure of the appropriate language for that, but also with the way in which there are spill-on effects for development financing that we're all dealing with. And so part of what I think we're dealing with in this conversation is how do you handle that double whammy of already having a difficult environment of fragility to work on, but also at a particularly difficult moment. As you will have seen, we chose to name this session the descaling, because to some extent we need to manage that double whammy. Just to put some framing on some of the core ideas of scaling that we all deal with, and I see that in our participant group, I have many of my community of practice members and members of the executive board, so this will be not new to any of you, but three sort of categories that we often think of in the scaling community is innovation as a means for scaling, convening, and financing. So innovation is when we're looking at with careful awareness of context, we're looking to propagate innovative evidence-based ideas and see how those can take hold and grow of their own accord. We're also looking at convening. We're looking at bringing together actors that can reinforce each other, that can help to bring stakeholders that have some of the best ideas and see how those best ideas can reinforce each other and promote a more scaled and sustainable outcomes. And then finally, we talk a lot about financing. How can we mobilize sustainable resources that can generate incentives that will help that spread and collaboration? Now, as Pallavi said, I'm at the World Bank, and one of the predilections of the World Bank is to focus on financing. But we in the World Bank also are involved in all three of these aspects of scaling. Through our knowledge bank function, we're looking to promote and propagate innovation. We convene development partners and stakeholders that are trying to really leverage how we can all work together, but we also do a lot of work on development financing. The financing approach to scaling that the World Bank sees as sort of primary is to first work through governments. The parts of the World Bank that I focus on, the IBRD and IDA, our primary approach is to partner with governments to provide resources through sovereign governments to try to scale up some of these good innovations, some of these ideas that have come out of our convening, out of the development finance convening. But also, and I'm so pleased to have Ivy on this, through the private sector work of the IFC, we try to leverage as much private sector money as we can, but also innovation and convening. And with our work with MIGA, we're looking to try to make, to de-risk investment environments that can make it so that private sector money can operate more effectively. Those are sort of the core elements of how we think about scaling and the World Bank's role in them. Now, but we're all desperately aware of the really serious shocks that we've been dealing with. And those knock-on effects are felt across the community. They're particularly felt in the fragile states area. And that's part of what we're looking to have people think through, is it's becoming much harder to operate in already difficult environments. Now, as Pallavi said, I manage social policy for the World Bank in Western Africa, and we have a large number of fragile states in West Africa, but that thinking through, and I would say that social policy for the World Bank in West Africa is as close as the World Bank comes to this humanitarian development nexus. The scaling difficulties in fragile states at this current moment are particularly difficult because the way the World Bank operates as one of our scaling approaches is we're trying to work with governments. But fragile states are always going to have weak government environments, weak institutional environments. So scaling through governments in fragile states is particularly hard. And furthermore, it's particularly difficult at the moment, but always difficult, as I presume that we'll be speaking about, to attract private sector money in these fragile states. So in this moment, when the development community is hit with such an earthquake of financing difficulty, and we're trying to operate to scale up through governments, through private sector financing, through collaboration, through innovation, we really are dealing with an already difficult environment in an already difficult situation. And so what I'm looking forward to, without building false expectations, is thinking through, or having our panelists help us think through some of the approaches for what is clearly a pivotal moment for scaling in fragile states. Let me stop there and look forward to hearing what Rob, Ivy, and Bhumi have to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rob Chase. We will now invite Rob Jenkins to come take the virtual stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And it's great to be here. I must say I'm new to the community, but I've watched it from afar. And about every year, there'd be at the Ronald Reagan building of the USAID offices, there'd be a poster up by the elevators about a scaling event. And it usually was Larry Cooley. So Larry, it's nice to see that you're here. I was asked to share some of the experience and learnings from the Office of Transition Initiatives, which I'll say a little bit about what that is first, and the obstacles to scaling that we experienced. OTI, the Office of Transition Initiatives, was created in 1994 to take advantage of critical moments in time. Either a peace deal has been signed, or there's been an advance in democracy, or there's a threat of conflict. And OTI is supposed to get in there, be fast, be very agile, figure out whatever needs to be done and do it. People like to say, we used to like to say, if you've seen one OTI program, you've seen one OTI program, because they're very, very different in different places. But all of them worked in the same way. The way it was operationalized were small grants under contract or under a cooperative agreement. So you would have one major implementing partner, and they would put small amounts of money on small problem sets quickly. That was the modus operandi. And that could be building a bridge. That could be supporting a fashion show. Sadly, yes, we did a fashion show once in Macedonia. That could be women's groups, youth groups. That could be fixing police stations. It could be just about anything that needed to be done. But many small activities, and the office worked in about 13 to 17 countries at a time, and probably 1,800 to 2,000 different activities globally every year. So some of these grants, they averaged about $40,000. They'd be a 2 or 3 month activity, but some were a $400 one-day event, and others would be over $100,000 for 6 months. So it's a very diverse problem set. In some places it was countering violent extremism. Some places it was advancing democratic gains. Other places it was conflict prevention, your good old stabilization exercise. It could really be just about anything, and that was the trick. But that meant it was very hard to scale as far as size, because in the bureaucracy that was USAID, and hopefully will not be in whatever the future looks like, but probably will be, everything is constrained by the type of money that you're using. So if you have a health program, you're using health money, and that's all you can do with it. And if you want to do education, there's education money. But if you want to do whatever a community needs, or whatever a struggling new democracy needs in West Africa, then you need money that's flexible that allows you to do anything that needs to be done. And that was very rare. That's contingency funding. And that's hard to get by. It was called Transition Initiative Funding, or State Department had economic support funds. They still do. You can do just about anything, and sometimes you can even break the law. It has notwithstanding authority. So if there's a pesky little law that's in the way and you want to help the government in Burundi prepare for peace talks with the rebels, but that government came about through a coup and the law says we can't work with them, hey, we can break that law, notwithstand it, tell Congress, hey, we gotta make this happen. We know we're not supposed to help this government, but it's in our interests and in their interest if we help them. You can do that. That money was very rare. So on the one hand, it's hard to scale up and make a lot more work when you don't have the money for it. Then sometimes you would have the money, a thing called a supplemental, and I can point to an Afghanistan or an Iraq where suddenly everybody was flooded with money. More money than anyone actually ever wanted. We were turning down money because with money comes expectations. And in Iraq, at the time, the entire OTI budget for the world was about $45 million. OTI Iraq got $419 million in 3 years and did 5,000 projects. Were all those projects great? No. It was stupid money. And for 20 years since, I turned down money for programs many times within the US government, always going back to saying, I know we can spend the money, but I know we can spend it stupidly. We were putting 60,000 people to work every day by handing them $5 at the end of the day. You can burn through a lot of money that quickly. So while you could get scale for reach, you can't get scale on those kinds of programs for sustainability or for institutionalization, because you're throwing money at people. It's not a collaborative process, and it has very little tail end on it. It happens, it's done, and it's not the best development in the world. So you have the barrier to scale there is good grants, good activities are relationship intensive. They are high touch and bespoke. So maybe it's a $40,000 activity in northern Ghana, but you've been sitting with that community and those community leaders for weeks, developing what they want and developing what that activity is going to be. And even though it doesn't take much money to do it, and that's good because you don't have much money, that community group can live on and be resilient and sustainable long after that $40,000 when, and there's many stories, happy to tell some about things that were very small grants that are still in existence 20 years later. So there's that kind of scale, but you don't get the scale on the reach. So then everyone talks about private sector, and everyone goes, and now everyone's talking about private sector, and philanthropy is going to save the day. Breaking news, philanthropy is not going to save the day. For my entire career working in these fragile conflict environments, everyone was always telling me in USAID, Rob, you got to partner with the private sector, public-private partnerships. And I'd say, what kind of public-private partnership are we going to do in Kandahar? There's not a whole lot of partners there to talk to. Or in Kosovo, when it was just coming out, you name the place, it is very hard to find partners in the private sector that are there and willing to partner. And if they are, because often you'd found them, Coca-Cola's there and they want to do water. Well, I don't do water. I could do water, but I don't want to do water. And their money came with a lot of strings attached. Microsoft wanted to do stuff, but you'd have to do things. So suddenly we weren't doing the projects we wanted to. If we wanted to access the private funding, then we quickly had to be donor driven in that sense by whatever that donor wanted. And that didn't often, or almost rarely, did that coincide with what the community wanted or needed. So private partner, they were hard to find. And watching my other aid colleagues, it seemed like an intense amount of effort and time that went into building public-private partnerships. And we just didn't have the time. So we largely, don't tell anybody at aid, they're not there anymore anyway. I largely ignored them on the public-private partnerships. It would be great if something dropped into our lap in, let's say, Nigeria, but it just wasn't the way to go. So looking now around at the world without USAID funding and the other donors constricting their funding, things have, as Rob alluded to, things are not getting better. I could say, great, we can go out there and the private sector is the way to go on the finances. That is slow, that is long. And while OTI particularly was not doing public-private partnerships, almost every OTI program was getting in any country was by design trying to get the environment to a place where in the future you could have more public-private partnerships, more private. That's not going to be happening anytime soon. So I am curious. I'm happy to take any questions, but I'm curious to hear from all of you what brilliant ideas you have and how we're going to get more financing when in these places that it was hard before and now it's going to be even harder. So I'll just end with, so if you want to scale for size and reach, you need flexible funding and you need a lot of it, which is hard to get. Two, too much scale too quickly hinders your creativity, it hinders your innovation, it hinders your convening, and it hinders your institutionalization. If you have a program that is bespoke, excellent, and it's a Ferrari, and you try to mass produce that Ferrari, you end up with a Fiat, and that doesn't necessarily get you where you want to go, unless you want a Fiat. And then third, if you want to scale for institutionalization and for sustainability, it's really about, it's very possible with very little amounts of money. It's everything that we tried to do with the Global Fragility Act. It's working in true partnership with country partners, letting them own things, supporting people in their ideas, only working on things where there's political will. And then they have a much greater success rate of those things carrying on long after the donor leaves the scene. So there you go. Happy to take questions. And I think still any lessons learned, why, how. I'm happy to get into that later on the questions. I see one in the chat. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, Rob. It's always so illuminating to hear from people who've been there, done that, and there are lessons that we can take forward. So maybe this is where Ivy can come in with the lessons that she's learning on the ground in Haiti. Over to you, Ivy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and a huge thanks to my colleagues at the World Bank and in donor organizations that supported us. So my name is Ivy Cooperberg. I am the country officer for the International Finance Corporation, part of the World Bank Group, for Haiti, the Bahamas, and also Creative Industries Lead. To really work at the World Bank, you need to just know acronyms and have a long title. So for myself, I came to Haiti in 2010, probably 2 months after the earthquake. And so a lot of what Rob was saying really resonated. And I come from a background both in working in the NGO space, so working with Catholic Relief Services for 5 years in both Haiti and about 20 countries in West and Central Africa, as well as working in FDI and then now for IFC, engaging primarily with the private sector. I think that both in Haiti as well as in those West African countries where you had a lot of these elements of fragility, the lessons that I always found, and I consolidate them into 3, although there's always lessons and they're always changing, is essentially know the rules, know when they change, and assume that logic governs most actions. And to me, what this means is that if you come into Haiti and we would have this during the crisis. You can't go out on the roads today. There's a protest. Oh, but I was out on the roads yesterday. It was fine. I want to go. No, or I need to move containers from this port to the other port. And then things change very quickly. And there's the bad areas, there's the good areas, there's ways that you have to follow protocol. Sometimes, an issue we get in fragile countries is the establishment of a company or the registration of securities. Yes, in other countries, it can be quicker. And then, they'll get some frustration of, but it should be 2 weeks or it should be 2 minutes. And we say, yes, but in Haiti, these are the 20 steps you need to do. They are manageable, they are doable, but there always is that resistance, right? We're human. We want to make things more efficient. We want to be able to do it, but really understanding that even as you're adapting and working in certain countries, understanding what those processes and procedures are is very helpful in terms of moving things forward. And so I think what we've really tried to do with IFC in Haiti is look and say, well, what are the needs, right? And oftentimes in development, sometimes we're trying to do branding, we're trying to come up with very nice packaging. And in Haiti, you'll find, for example, in renewable energy, no matter what we call it, the business wants to turn on a switch and have it work. Right? It's as simple as that. If they're going into a factory and they're producing water for Port-au-Prince, they want their machine to turn on. If they need to turn on the lights in their business, they need those lights to turn on. And so what we found in Haiti was that going in, really understanding what the private sector needed, we were able to actually get ahead of the curve. For example, in renewable energy, where a lot of times the high level of capital costs that you have to do at the beginning, it's hard to convince a company to do that because they can get gas on the open market. In Haiti, where all of a sudden gas was not available or becoming $40 a gallon on the black market, you had companies that actually were interested in spending 2 to 3 million to be able to get that infrastructure to be able to allow them to produce. So the domestic private sector was an area where we really tried to work within the country, understand what they were doing, and I would say really help them improve what was already working. In Haiti, one of the jokes is it's always the worst it's ever been. So right now there is certainly a lot of concerns, a lot of fragility, a lot of challenges. And so when we go and talk to a company, yes, how are they managing now? What are the difficulties? But how did they deal with the last time it was the worst it's ever been? How did they deal with the crisis of 5 years ago, of 10 years ago, of 15 years ago? And that kind of gives us a benchmark for, is this a company that we can work with and that we can really help get to the next level? And so once the company kind of figures out what works for them, that's where we come in with our solutions to be able to make them more efficient, more productive, and more responsive to global needs. I would say in other areas too, a joke I always go with is that in these small states, and particularly in island economies, there's always discussions about imports, right? We want to boost domestic production and we want to limit the risk that comes from having to import basic goods. So CARICOM at one point said, for all of the Caribbean, we're going to reduce imports by 25%. And then if you kind of caught what was going on in the news in Haiti a year ago when the airports shut down, I always say we reduced imports by 100%. Obviously, that creates a lot of challenges, but it really does spur the private sector to want to get that circular economy. And so when we're talking with businesses, it's, this has happened. Once again, know the rules. This is going to be the situation. We know that oftentimes when a country is hit, there's that acute phase, but then it goes into chronic and things don't get resolved as quickly as we would like. So what are we going to do to address that? And so for that, we were able to boost with agriculture and work with those companies to really say, what do you need to do if things aren't coming in? Or what are other ways that we can work with you in advisories to make those things more efficient? And then I would say 3, there's a lot of logic. We were talking to a company the other day and they said, when I first came to Haiti, I didn't understand why the banks were so liquid. Now that I've been here 10 years, I understand a bit more why there is that reticence for lending, what their risk understanding is, and where risk can be mitigated and where risk maybe can't be mitigated for the moment, but can be in the future. So usually, one of the issues I'm sure that we all see is people go into an environment and things seem so simple to fix. And those are usually the most complicated. And sometimes there are those simple fixes, right? One of the things that happened after the earthquake that is a huge success in Haiti was the use of cash. right? So after the earthquake, everybody was sending goods to Haiti, and then pretty clearly it became understood that actually the private sector in Haiti really was quite well stocked. And if you gave people money to be able to buy the products, then that would really help and support the private sector. It's much more efficient. It limits the risk of theft. And so that became the go-to. So wasn't used in 2010, but then when there was the earthquake in 2021, when there was Hurricane Matthew in 2016, those things became established. So it's slow, and I think that can be frustrating for a lot of us. You go into these fragile contexts and you see so much need, and some things can look very familiar, some things can be completely different, and you want to move quickly. And so I think too, really kind of understanding where to use those resources. And then when you do understand those resources, at least from my perspective, in the donor environment, in the co-funding and the partnerships, people want to see the results first. They don't want to see massive results, but if money is being spent, they want to see that it's working even at a smaller level before you can ask. I think sometimes there's been a bit of a dichotomy where we say, if you give us this, we will show you that we can do that. And now oftentimes with partners, they want to say, well, what have you done already, right? How have you previously optimized? And then we go to the next level, but we want to see results before we can come in. So Haiti is very challenging. A lot of the countries that we've been discussing are very challenging. I think they're more logical in terms of behaviors, market dynamics, private sector needs, wants, and willingness to invest, and really being very specific, understanding the histories. I am a history major, and seeing where those entry points are and just continuing to make sure that you're following the rules, adapting to the rules, and communicating in a way. We always joke in Haiti, you ask, well, what's going on in Haiti today? And people say, well, I mean, first you have to understand 2021, but really 2018, but really 2010, but really 1991, and then we're back to 1804. And so it is also part of us as well that even if I think I know the context and I want to reference, what's happening in 1957, thinking of how to present that in a tangible way, in a comparative way that people can really understand, and then continue to buy into what we're doing at IFC, both within the private sector in Haiti and the global environment, and be able to engage in a way that produces those tangible results and is replicable. And there we go. Exactly. I can always talk for hours, but I'll give it a pause there because I think, as our other speakers were saying, the questions and the ideas that people are going to share is also going to help us spur and make sure that we're addressing certain points and thinking in different new ways.
Ivy, that was absolutely fabulous. Understanding history and identifying entry points. That, to me, that's the headline, and it's a brilliant segue into what we hope Bhumi is going to present before us. And Bhumi has a really fascinating sort of window through which he's looking. It's the African continent with its diverse set of contexts. Not everywhere in Africa is fragile, but the bank has to manage a lot of context. So over to you, Bhumi. We're eagerly listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think it's not a small challenge because I am going to be speaking about a continent, not a country. I'm not just a sub-region within a continent. Now, I sit here at the headquarters of the African Development Bank, and every day what I do is I look at the data. I look at reports that are coming from each and every member of the 54 countries that the bank is serving. Now, I see significant differences, significant variations, and I know for some countries, I know if I locate them in a random sampling and I pick a country from, a different continent, I'll get exactly the same attributes. No one would be able to say that this is an African country. So this is how diverse the continent is. So we have countries that have, significant challenges, but we have countries that are progressing significantly with, significant private sector investment across the board. Now, but because you started with my question on with a statement that says Africa is a mixed bag of fragile and conflict-affected countries, now I will then tell you that when we talk about the implications of what we do, that is either in the context of whether we are scaling or we are descaling or we are just carrying on as business as usual, those implications are actually determined by specific country context. Now, for example, if we look at a country in two scenarios, for example, a country that is facing situations where its pressures are significantly higher than its institutional and resource capacities. Now, when we talk about scaling or descaling in that country, it's completely different from when we are talking about scaling and descaling in a country where its pressures are within the capabilities of its resources and its institutions. Now, this result in completely different outcomes for different countries. Now, for example, you will know that for every country, when we talk about descaling, in the example of significant ODI withdrawal, we are not only talking about the amount or the fraction of the country's total investment that is in that ODI that is coming out, but we are talking about the fact that the core partners that are investing in that sector, for example, health, is going to be completely put at halt. Now, we are not only stopping there, we are saying this kind of descaling also means that the country government that has invested maybe up to 75% of resources in that sector could go to waste. And this is simply because someone or some partner has committed 25% and all of a sudden there are no more there. So these are the big consequences of descaling. It is not just the 25% that is lost. It is the 25% plus the fact that the 75% will no longer be at work, but plus the fact that the entire 75% could actually go to waste. So these consequences can be looked at both in terms of how widespread they affect populations in fragile and conflict-affected settings, but also, even if they are concentrated in subnational levels, we can talk about the intensity, of the consequences for the population that these consequences are concentrated on. Now, again, it doesn't stop there. The consequences of descaling can go for several years, and that is the persistence factor. Now, this persistence factor means that particular community could take a decade or two before they can actually get back to where they used to be. Now, the third implication of this descaling that is also going to be different depending on the country context is the fact that there are spillover consequences. Now, beyond the community that suffers a sudden descaling, and that probably lead to escalation of problems, meaning a community, conflict, or even scramble over scarce resources, or lack of, public utility that leads to riot and, protracted protest and conflict. This could spill over not only from within that country, but to the neighboring countries. And then because we are talking about peace and stability as not only regional public good, but as a global good, the consequences could actually spread across the continent. Now, within the African continent, scaling also, we will have to reflect on, the specific country context we are talking about. Now, if you talk about Sahel, for example, the problems, the challenges, are completely different. There we're talking about violent extremism. We are talking about cattle herder conflicts over scarce natural resources that is triggered by climate change. Then you go to the Horn of Africa. There again, we are talking about droughts. We are talking about governance challenges. So across the continent, each part, I wouldn't only say each region, but each country, and I could also even go each subnational, levels have their challenges that are completely different, and the challenges that come with this scaling, are big and are very specific to those communities. Now, here at the African Development Bank, we have to organize ourselves in that context to be able to provide the necessary response that a development bank and a regional development bank, for that matter, needs to provide. Now, we have to, because number one, we don't have a choice. These are really our member countries, and every country really matters. And this is why we decided as a bank to do away with a discriminatory term that calls these countries fragile states. So we use more of transition states, and then we recognize that the state of fragility can actually be, a non-country specific, characteristic. It could occur at a subnational level. It could occur across boundaries, and it would occur in what we call pockets of fragility. So therefore, describing a country as a fragile state is not a terminology that we're using. So when I use transition states, I'm using a term that is, commonly used by the bank in this context. Now, to be able to deal with scaling, now we believe that there is a need for that big push that is coordinated and that is in partnership with others, but also that is based on sustainability principles. Now, in terms of doing this big push, we ensure that in our financing instrument, for our concessional financing, we created a layer that we call the transition support facility, which we are using as a supplementary financing for countries that we consider to be in transition. Now, the reason is simple. Now, our bigger pot of concessional funds are normally performance-based. That is to say, as countries perform in their reforms, in their policy agenda, we kind of increase the resources that we allocate to them. But then we recognize that there are a set of countries that are not on equal platforms, and as a result, they are not able to compete like other countries. So subjecting them to resource allocation that is driven by the performance-based allocation is probably, a disincentive for them to even compete. And as a result, the gap will get wider and wider. So the transition support facility comes to address this. Now, the facility has 4 important windows. I don't need to go into all those windows, but specifically, the supplementary finance window, which we call our Pillar 1, is targeting principally how do we address the root causes of fragility within the countries at their subnational level and at the regional level. And that way, we are creating a path for these countries to catch up with those that are ahead of them. So within that facility also, we have what we call area clearance facility, which helps us clear areas of countries that have fallen behind so that they are able to re-engage with the international community, to be able to get access to financing, especially concessional financing that can help them move. But more importantly, and that is very much related to scaling, is our third window, which is a targeted support and technical assistance facility, a window. Now, this window provides resources that target supporting institutional strengthening and capacity building. And most of the time, these are normally the targeted kind of interventions that help us unlock capabilities, jumpstart the reforms so that the private sector and other funding agencies can actually come on board to be able to support these countries. Now, we have a new president at the African Development Bank that has started just last year. Now, we have what we call our 4 cardinal points. Now, the 4 cardinal points are principally just focused on what the scaling agenda is seeking to achieve. And that is mobilize resources at scale, strengthen domestic finance institutions to be able to tackle the big development challenge that the African continent faces. So therefore, the 4 cardinal points seek to ensure that we are able to respond to the development challenges of the continent, at scale, but also in partnership with others. Now, in terms of leveraging partnerships, now we recognize that the complementarity that other non-development finance institutions bring in some contexts of fragility or in situations of fragility is extremely important, because we recognize that fragility itself is such a complex issue. No development or no entity has the mandate to be able to do all around the circle in terms of what is needed. So this coordinated response, alongside with partners for us, has been paying off. And this is what we have done with the ICRC. This is what we have done with the UNHCR, in circumstances where we are not able to even step in. Think about the situation in Sudan. Think about the refugee crisis that have been generated by the conflict in Sudan. This also requires other partners with competency, in operating in those kind of environments, to be able to deliver, the development that needs to be delivered to those people. Now, again, it is extremely important. I talked about the sustainability part of it. Now, on the sustainability part, the bank has a balancing act in terms of how much we are doing, both in the public sector, but also in the private sector. Because if we think about scaling and we want to get results, it's not just push one side and go. We have to be able to balance these two. Because today what we are talking about, and the other colleagues spoke about this before me, that bringing the private sector in some of these fragile settings is extremely difficult. And sometimes it is impossible or near impossible situation. So then what do? We ensure that we use our concessional funds to help governments respond to the critical bottlenecks that the private sector has pointed as factors that are stopping them from entering these markets. Now, those responses have to be targeted. We know government reforms are big, and this is what development finance institutions have been doing for decades. But for us to get results that can put us on the path to scaling through the private sector, we must enter through the government side, but with the view that we are going in to solve the private sector problem. And this is how we see the use of our catalytic concessional funds in some of the countries facing situations of fragility. So identifying what the private sector needs are, and then solving them from the side of the government. Now, in addition to that, we also know that in some of these countries, the needs are more than just solving the bottlenecks. It also requires that hand-holding with the government, such that, for example, if we want to roll out PPPs, the problem is not that the private sector is not interested, but sometimes the problem is that their counterpart, which is the public sector, does not have the capacity that is needed to actually enter into those transactions. So we are financing, government PPP initiatives that involve not just the legal reforms that need to be in place, but also hand-holding PPP ecosystem actors to actually demonstrate how they can start doing this with local, small-scale private sector actors that want to partner with governments to do PPP transactions. So from there, we are able to graduate them to be able to have a PPP arrangement with bigger international investors in those countries. And also at the same time, building confidence on the side of the private sector to be able to respond to the demand that government is putting on the plate. Now, beyond that, on the private sector side, it is difficult, but we have to also do a demonstration. And a development finance institution like us will have to put guarantees on the table. We'll have to, co-finance with the private sector so that we give them the comfort and the confidence that some of these countries are actually investable. And if we can say that we take the risk, then it is a signal for them that, oh, indeed, it is a perception issue, but indeed, some of these countries are investable. Now, engaging in the private sector to scale is also, another complexity that requires a very context-specific approaches. Now, for us to be able to put these economies on what I will call autopilot mode, where public sector intervention is minimized and private sector is now in the driving seat to deliver development at scale, we need to ensure that the risk perceptions are actually aligned with the actual risk situations in these countries. Now, in Africa, for example, people will hear about, for example, subnational ethnic violence in one country, and then for an investor that has not explored Africa to that extent, just thinks that, oh, this is an African problem. It is not. It is like having a situation in just a small part of a country in Europe, while the rest of Europe is just at peace. So these things happen in every continent. So bringing this risk perception, in line with the actual risk situations is extremely important for the private sector. Then, in addition, going beyond that, we also have heard about a lot of issues on, conflicts that are natural resource based, that are based on private sector investment. So we must invest in private sector's conflict sensitivity. They do no harm, but the intentionally doing good by the private sector has to be on the table at the very beginning when we start building pipelines and so on. And this is exactly what the African Development Bank is doing in Mozambique. If you go to the Cabo Delgado region, where we have been supporting, to bring investments that not only bring peace, but give livelihood opportunities to young people. But beyond that, we said, look, for the private sector, we finance an initiative that we call the Peace and Security Investment Hub that is going to be building a pipeline of investments, private sector investments that are conflict sensitive, that are peace positive in nature, so that private sector actors can actually pick on those investments and run with them. So the peace positive considerations, in terms of attracting private sector is extremely important, especially when we talk about conflict effects. So let me conclude. Now, for us at the African Development Bank, scaling is a very country-specific consideration. For every country, we need to look at it based on where it is and based on what their immediate needs are. Scaling also requires a very strong public sector, that has capacity to also coordinate the scaling, but to also give the confidence to the private sector that these countries are investable. And finally, scaling with the private sector requires a long-term, but a lot of efforts that first adjust the risk perceptions and also align private sector investment with conflict sensitivity and peace considerations. I will stop here and thank you. Over.
Thank you so much, Bhumi. I mean, this is such incredible piece for thought and such a
masterclass. I feel like I just sat through a masterclass.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have more coming because we have some excellent questions from our participants. I'll just very quickly round off some of the key lessons so that we can hand over to our panelists. Rob Chase began with the 3 approaches to scaling. That's innovation, convening, and development finance. Rob Jenkins reminded us that private sector is not panacea. Sometimes it can be very donor driven, and those are the problems. You can have a very diverse set of activities, which becomes very hard to scale. But what Rob said, very importantly, he used the words bespoke, relationship intensive, and high touch. And these are really some of the hallmarks how to scale well with the kind of networking that's required to bring really innovative projects to scale. Ivy, your points were, really pragmatic. The problem with should be versus is, and to work with the is extremely important to recognize and realize and improve what is happening. Deal with the last time. How did you deal with it the last time it was this bad? And to take lessons from there, because we tend to forget that it was bad the last time too. And understanding history and identifying entry points and take us back to 1804. And a lot of us in the development field don't really go back to pre-colonial times, to the colonial transition when institutions were still, evolving. What does that mean for current development outcomes? So fabulous there. And Bhumi, of course, sorry, Africa is a continent, not a country. I think that's something that everybody's now beginning to very, very correctly realize, the diversity of efforts and the scale of efforts, that's extremely important. And the consequences of the descaling, as you very correctly said. And I thought it was very striking. The donor might have got 75%, which seems like a lot of money, and the country government only 25%. But the 25% is a lot for countries at that level of per capita income and that level of capability and capacity. So when you take the 75% away, the entire edifice then collapses, and that indeed there is a persistence problem over there. And of course, the point you made about transition, not fragile, I think it's very important also to change how we think in terms of our mental maps when we are addressing fragility. So just to tie it all together, it is about governance, it is about relationship building, it is about working with the what is, it's about history, it's about recognizing that there is a complexity of context. And I think the other very important aspect that we probably need to work on as the next phase in our attempts at scaling and understanding how to scale is the enforcement or implementation gap. We have the best rules, we have the best kind of concessional finance, we bring the horse to the water. How do you make the horse drink? How do you make sure that the financing is actually used for that kind of outcome? How do you direct that energy in the right manner? So I'm going to stop here and hand over to Chris for our set of questions. Thank you.
Great. So thank you, panelists. This has been a very engaging panel. We are going to move to questions now, and is Rob Chase able to join us?
I think I'm on.
Okay, thanks, Rob. All right, so we're going to do 3 questions at a time and allow the panel to respond. As they're responding, or if you have more questions coming up, please continue dropping them in the chat. For now, let's start with the first round. And the questions are coming from, and if I mispronounce your name, I apologize in advance. The questions are coming from Larry, Arshad, and Bonaventure. So Bonaventure asks, how do you sequence innovation, convening, and mobilizing finance in a context where trust has completely collapsed? And what does this tell us about, when do we know the environment is ready to move from one pillar to the next? Larry says, in many cases, money rushes into crises and exits after a relatively short period. What have we learned about strategies for double purposing humanitarian resources to address persistent and persisting problems? And then Arshad had a lot of contrast questions, so I kind of put them together because they're very excellent. So first he said Ivy's message about improving what's working, especially with the private sector, as opposed to Rob's view, really difficult and private sector has its own objectives. Before thinking of innovation and scaling is salutary. These are 2 different views, Rob's small amounts making a difference versus thinking of what's working and giving it a boost. And then also juxtaposing Bhumi's presentation with Rob Chase's point that government or institutions are weak, so what are we left with? And perhaps we can start with Rob Chase and Rob Jenkins on the first question from Bonaventure, and Ivy and Bhumi, feel free to chime in as well.
Thanks. Bonaventure, really excellent question. And look, I want, if I created the suggestion that those 3 elements need to be sequenced, I think they do need to work simultaneously. I think, but more importantly, I'm really taken, and I think it's so important to be aware that when working in FCV settings, there is another element. There are several other elements, but that other element is trust. There was a piece that in some ways launched this working group, and Larry's on the call, but I don't know, and Jonathan Popolidis, who is my working group chair for a long time, did a piece in 2017 that highlighted that working in fragile settings, you need to think of a triple bottom line. You need to think about resources, but you need to think about managing risks, and you need to think about addressing the root causes of risk. I think, Bonaventure, that you're really onto something when talking about trust, because that which is missing oftentimes in these settings is trust and legitimacy of actors, and figuring out how to build that sense of strengthening the trust of the people and the sense of legitimacy among the people in actors in institutions in these settings is key. There's work that I did years and years ago on Mindanao in the Philippines, and thinking about how by taking community development approaches, looking at community-driven development and asking for a conversation, for having transparent discussions among actors, is a crucial piece that can help build that trust and legitimacy. And I think that some of those ideas about CDD that are been around for a long time, they still seem to be working. What I'm excited about now in the World Bank, in my team, is trying to work on some of those in the Lake Chad region, and figuring out how you can try to build that trust at a local level to strengthen that legitimacy. And with that, we hope that we'll be able to address, bring in some of those innovations, bring in some of convene actors to come together in those settings, and to ultimately increase financing both from development partners, but also potentially from private sector. And I'm really interested to hear both Rob and Ivy on the opportunities for, when private sector can work and when it's really just very, very difficult. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Rob. Bonaventure, trust is, you nailed it. In all of these environments, that's one of the commodities that people need the most of, and that's lacking. From OTI's perspective, many of the programs over the last 30-something years, at the base of what the objective of the program was, it was to build trust. It was to build trust between, in Macedonia, it's Albanian speakers and Slav speakers. It's between herders and farmers. It's between government and the people. It's between the police and community activists. You name it. A lack of trust is one of the hallmarks of these environments. When you talk about sequencing, in my experience, like Rob said, there's no real sequencing. You can't, everything has, if you wait to do something that's necessary until the first thing's done, you'll never get to step 2. It would be great if you could sequence things. It's one of the reasons we got rid of the relief to development. In one country, you're doing development, you're doing relief, you're doing peace building, you're doing things in different provinces at the same time. In one village, you can be doing long-term conflict prevention while you're doing immediate humanitarian assistance. It sounds messy, but it's true. You have to do everything that's necessary as you can do it, which is a challenge, because with not enough resources, you do have to prioritize. And there's some serious Sophie's choice moments in there sometimes, because you can't do everything. But you can't wait, and you're not going to know when you move to the next pillar. There's no graduation moment. If I can touch just on Larry's thing about infusion of resources, which you have and I see some of my humanitarian assistance colleagues on the call. You take a place like Sierra Leone or Liberia, or you can think of the place right now, Haiti. The crisis happens, it's flooded with largely humanitarian assistance and some other development assistance. 2 or 3 years later, most of that funding has receded to the next hotspot. And the long-term development folks are left with their same little measly amounts of money trying to solve for what the disaster was. So yes, it'd be great if we could harness some of that energy and, frankly, the money when those tsunamis of cash happen. My experience is, and this is a flaw that I hope in a redesign of foreign assistance, at least this government, our government in the United States, can do a better job of, is everybody has their own objectives and their own money is tied to those objectives. And this really, we talk about the triple nexus. 10 years on, we haven't gotten anywhere on the triple nexus because the humanitarians are doing their work and the long-term people are doing their work. And the peace builders, well, they have no money, but they're trying to do their work. And if you see a great opportunity to use humanitarian funding to do peace building, the humanitarians say, stop, can't do that. That's not humanitarian. That's very political. And I used to wonder why in South Sudan were IDPs not covered by the USAID mission. They were covered by humanitarians. IDPs had been there since I was there in the early 90s, and they'd been there long before that. It's a steady state. It's not an emergency, but the mindset always was humanitarians do IDPs, long-term development works on long-term development. So we squander the opportunity of being able to move from one category to another because everyone's locked into, for good reasons, Congress and others have said, you have to do this with this money, you have to do this with this money. The key, and a lot has happened lately, the last few years in this, is how do you implement your emergency programs with cash, that's great, but how do you also strengthen that women's group, strengthen that youth group, and we saw this in Sudan, working through communities had huge effects on social cohesion that was never an objective of humanitarian assistance, but it does get you to a more sustainable long-term outcome.
If I may add something on Rob Jenkins' point, which I think is a very strong point, and this is core to any success that we are going to make in the scaling, and that is really the walls that exist between development finance institutions, the humanitarian actors, and the peace on the other side. All of us speak about this nexus, but then translating it on the ground, continues to be difficult and challenging. So it is because of this that the African Development Bank, and I think alongside many other entities, I guess the IFC is also one of those, have joined the World Economic Forum in what they call their humanitarian resilient investing. Now, what this seeks to do is really bring us together to focus on one thing. And in the context of Africa, what we are looking for is how do we think about long-term sustainability, at the time when we are even entering, as a humanitarian actor, how do we think about, the fact that, okay, I'm bringing this relief, but my objective is for this to be scaled up by the development finance institutions after me, rather than just a one-time relief that goes away a lot of cash that nobody ever is able to track again, nobody is ever able to build on again, and so on. So we are working very collaboratively with partners to do what we call a roadmap for the implementation of the WEFHRI, that is the World Economic Forum, Humanitarian Resilient Investing, where we will support governments in the identification of the bottlenecks, in the reforms that need to be made, but also in mobilizing partners collectively as one, to support that initiative, and also the private sector coming on board to take up deals that are both, impact oriented, but also have very good positive returns in those countries. But we need to do more. That is what my emphasis is. We should do more in translating the nexus into action on the ground.
And I'm wondering, Bumi, I mean, part of this annual convening of the Scaling Community of Practice annual event is to see what we can take out of our working group sessions in terms of action. And what I am hearing is there could be some advocacy actions that we could be taking as a group to address some of these structural bureaucracy challenges that are creating the situation that seems to be a blockage to actually implementing and operationalizing the triple nexus.
Absolutely.
Great. Ivy, anything from you, or would you like to address Arshad's question now?
No, I think everybody made very good points, and I know that we're a little low on timing, so I can go directly to Arshad's question. And this was, as I'm moving them on scale, right? Or am I mixing up everything? Remind me one more time.
Yeah, Arshad's question is about what's working, especially
what's working and what's putting everything in. Yeah, and I think that he actually, when I was looking at Arshad's, and I really appreciated that, it shows how important it is to know all the different actors, because I know Rob was touching on Coca-Cola, right? So this is a company that's active in the country that is then looking to use part of their money and perhaps a CSR approach that maybe blends private and public. And then at IFC, for example, we're working with domestic private sector. So the idea of that is if nobody came in at all, right, after the Haiti earthquake, what would have happened? Right. And so the domestic private sector would have found a way, even if operations stopped or their building collapsed. What do? They go into another building. They find a way to restart production. They use their own capital to be able to take the loss and to be able to increase. Some, of course, go out of business, some sustain. And so I think that really, this goes back to Bumi's point. Sometimes we use categories and they can fit really well in a certain context. And then in other contexts, they can mean everything and nothing at the same time. So it goes back to the idea of what are the different actors doing? If there's an umbrella term that we can put there, yes. And I always like to say, if we're not here, right? This has been in Haiti. If we weren't there to give tents after the earthquake, what would people have done? Probably go into relatives' homes and things like that. And that can kind of say, are the resources responding to needs? Are they giving people better outcomes? Or sometimes are we doing it because Pakistan had an earthquake and that's what worked there? Are we sure that's what's going to work here? So I think, to me, fragile context, it's keeping the economy moving. That's continuing to provide basic goods and services. My main indicator, honestly, in Haiti to understand if things are working is whether schools are open. Right? I can tell you what's going on in the private sector if schools are open, because that means roads are open. That means people are comfortable moving precious cargo back and forth on the streets, and that really serves as a nice thing. So for us, it's what are the companies going to do anyways? What are, once again, the entry points that we can go in to help them be better at doing that? Obviously, there's, reputation. There's certainly certain companies we can't work with, certainly in difficult settings, they're there. But what are they doing? How are they delivering those basic goods and services? Where can we go in? What does that look like? And I just keep going to logic, right? People act in their own interests. People are doing things to, as I always say in Haiti, the CSR is making payroll. You talk to any of these private sector companies, the number one thing they want to do, pay their employees at the end of the month, because they know that getting cash into their hands, I think the ratio of beneficiaries is 8 to 1. They know that it's helping. How are we going to allow them to do that? And how are we going to allow that basic service delivery, that employment, those jobs to continue moving and continue working without disruption? And then that tends to help the economy continue to advance.
Yeah, Ivy, I feel like I'm going to be inviting you to my Georgetown class because they are, anyway, we're going to talk after this. But I want to move on, since we have just 7 minutes left for our panel, to a quick, maybe rapid round of some of the other great questions. So from Pia, what I hear is everything is relative, and Pia's interested to hear examples of what has worked aligned to an initial plan with small scale investments, which then had unexpectedly greater impact. So not necessarily reach, I'm hearing in that question, but greater impact. From Alexandra, would welcome reflections as to whether many of the debates and discussions about financing occur after the funding actors' political, fiscal, and institutional decisions have already been made. As a result, substantial effort is spent on optimizing tools, improving mechanisms, and adjusting delivery arrangements, et cetera, but the underlying architecture that governs the actors' overall financing architect remains the same. We have addressed that a little bit, but maybe what practically could be done to change that? And from Todd, how does the incentive structure principle play in fragile states and addressing those left out of scaling agendas? I think, Todd, this came after during Ivy's presentation. So Ivy, if you want to start with that one, but everyone is welcome to respond.
So for us on the scaling, and this is on the scaling, what was that small event and then had that bigger impact. One of the things that we did was in renewable energy. And originally we did a $30,000 upstream study to be able to convince banks that it made sense to lend. One of the things IFC does is we don't compete with local banks. We're primarily a provider of debt and sometimes equity. And so what we did is did a small upstream study to convince companies that they should look at, or banks that they should look at investing in solar, and also that companies should look at investing in it as well. And after we did that, this also goes back to the fact that sometimes in Haiti, things are difficult, but not impossible. No one will answer a question on the phone, right? There's a lot of issues. This also goes back to trust. Sometimes there's not trust, but people trust who they trust. You get a trusted actor, they have to go, they have to meet face to face. People don't want to give financial information on the phone. It's often used in kidnapping. So you have to be very careful on how you're going to get this information. But once we got it, we made the case, and that led to a $3.5 to $4.5 million investment with the main water company in Haiti that this year is going to reduce diesel usage from 90% by 90%. And in Haiti, a lot of companies are completely off the grid because the power company can't provide, speaking of fragility. And so this allowed them to be more productive. It allowed their supply chains to be more resilient. And it also allowed them to have that benefit for the environment of not having to use all of that fuel. So for us, it was that small study that really catapulted that. And then based on that investment, we're going around to other companies and saying, look, your production also has these weaknesses in the supply chain. You're also very dependent on fuel, and sometimes that gets disrupted by the gangs. How can we replicate this? And we've seen increased interest. And that also goes back to the point of you need that one company to try it. And then once we get that example, keep promoting it, keep pushing it to be able to show other companies how it works. So that was really exciting for us and something that was very complicated to get off the ground, but we're very happy once it did.
Thanks, Ivy. And I'm noting that that was a really concrete and very helpful example of how this is working on the ground. So thank you for that. Noting we have 3 minutes, are there any panelists burning to answer one of the final questions? Because I'm not sure we'll all have a chance to speak again. Go ahead, Rob.
Quick try for Pia. Pia, it's great that you're here. Every OTI program, different people who worked on it have their favorite story about the grant that just is still going on. A big one was the OTI Pakistan program went over for 8 or 9 years. It was the longest program in OTI's history at that point, started around 2010. The idea was to help extend the writ of the Pakistani government into the FATA, the federally administered tribal lands, because they were not actually part of the constitution of Pakistan. 3,000 grants later, 2018, FATA becomes the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and is now actually part of Pakistan that it wasn't before. We never thought that was going to happen. Can we say that we can take complete responsibility for that? No, but in this world, you can rarely do that. The Kimberley Diamond process came out of a grant in Sierra Leone. The Exit Festival, which is still going on, I think, was a grant in 1999 and 2000 in Serbia. It is now the largest, and has been for over 20-something years, the largest cultural festival in Central and Eastern Europe, and it gets the biggest bands in the world. And the same time spent was OTI support to Otpor, which is a big part of Milosevic being kicked out of his job. 5-6 members of Otpor went on to create Canvas, which is an NGO that still exists and is did similar work to what Otpor did in over 50 countries, often with USAID funding, promoting democracy around the world. And that was never intended, never thought that would happen. And there's a long list of other good news stories like that.
And on that positive note, we will wrap this session. Thank you, huge thank you to our panelists for coming together for this hour and a half with us and sharing your experience. A big, huge thank you to our audience for being engaged, even though we've muted you and kept you off camera. It's great to have you here and partnering with us as we're thinking through these very difficult things and fragile states, or as we're now going to call it, transitional states. Thank you, Bhumi. And thanks for your great questions. We will be wrapping for now, and please join us on March 6th for the final compendium of our annual meeting, where we hope to share the reflections from these 2 weeks as well as next steps. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.